may remember that in 2020, Hong Kong implemented a national security law at the behest of Beijing. Among other things, it established 4 particular crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism and collusion with foreign organisations, as well as open speech or verbal promotion of Hong Kong's secession from China. You'll be unsurprised to hear that these crimes are interpreted really broadly to extinguish any behaviour that those in charge consider anti-China or a threat to Communist Party dominance. People accused of these crimes are, under the national security law, automatically extradited from Hong Kong to Beijing to be dealt with by China's version of the justice system. Now, that system contains none of the transparency and protections for the individual that we in Australia take for granted. Well, this week, the law was relied upon by Hong Kong to operate extraterritorially, that's outside of their territory, to threaten the freedom of pro-democracy figures located in Canada, the US, Britain and Australia. Hong Kong police put a Hong Kong $1 million bounty, it's worth about $191,000 in Australian dollars, on Melbourne-based lawyer Kevin Yam and on Ted Hui, a former Hong Kong politician who now lives in Adelaide. This is a really big step. And while the 2 men are relatively safe in Australia, it will be that they now, and perhaps forever, face restrictions on their ability to travel anywhere that has an extradition arrangement with China or Hong Kong. It's become more dangerous than ever for Westerners to do business in China after the government amended a key espionage law, with the changes taking effect just yesterday. The revised law is vague about what constitutes espionage and gives the communist government greater access to and control over companies' data, potentially turning what would be considered normal business activities into now criminal acts. It puts companies' intellectual property at unprecedented risk too. To help us understand what these 2 developments mean for Australians with ties to China, as well as our trade relationships, I'm joined by Victorian Senator James Paterson. Senator Paterson, welcome to the program tonight. What's been the response that you've received from the Chinese Australian community to the Hong Kong authorities' decision to put a bounty on Kevin Yam and Ted Hui?
Amanda, it's great to be with you, and no disrespect to my other friends at Sky, but my new favourite program on Sky News. This was a very chilling threat made by the Chinese Communist Party through the government of Hong Kong, through its proxy. First, as you say, to issue arrest warrants on an Australian resident and Australian citizen, then to issue a bounty for information about them, and finally to publicly say that they would be pursued for the rest of their lives and monitored wherever they are in the world. This is a very threatening attack on an Australian citizen and Australian resident and their rights to free speech, to campaign politically and to say what they feel in a liberal democracy like Australia. This is nothing less than the Chinese Communist Party trying to reach into the heart of Australian democracy and impose their political system on ours and impose their values on us. And so, quite rightly, it has been strongly rejected by the Hong Kong exile community in Australia, as it should be, and roundly condemned in politics, which I really welcome.
Does the imposition of the bounty increase the danger that these men face even while they're resident in Australia?
I think you made 2 really good points in your introduction, Amanda. Yes, a bounty on their heads means they can never sleep soundly at night, fearing that an agent of the Chinese Communist Party, or frankly just someone looking to make a buck, won't be feeding information back on them to Beijing. Now, that would be a crime in Australia, and I know the Federal Police and ASIO would take that very seriously, so no one should think they can get away with that. But the other point you made was really important, Amanda. Neither Ted nor Kevin can safely travel anywhere in the world that has an extradition treaty with either China or Hong Kong. And I'm ashamed to say today there are still dozens of countries around the world who have not yet done what Australia did back in 2020 and tore up our extradition treaty with Hong Kong. They should do so as soon as possible, because otherwise it's not a safe place for anyone to visit who has a disagreement with Beijing.
Well, Australians should know you were a big part of the reason why Australia doesn't have an extradition treaty with China. Have Australian businesses who deal with or in China been briefed by the Australian government about the impact of the changes that have been made to the espionage law?
That's a really good question. We don't know, Amanda, but there was a report in The Australian last week which suggested that some Australian businesses who do business in China were in the dark about the implications of this new anti-espionage law, the reforms so-called, in Beijing. It really has very profound implications for anyone operating in China, for anyone who has personnel that they employ in China. They were already at very significant risk, and that's why the official travel advice from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade was that they should exercise extreme caution if they intended to travel to China, because they're at risk of arbitrary detention and arrest, and that has been increased by this law because it effectively criminalises the commercial practice of engaging in business intelligence. That is, trying to assess the trends of the Chinese economy, the trends in legislation and law, and how that affects business interests. And advising clients of that overseas is now potentially a crime in China. So I think the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Minister should consider, in fact, increasing our travel advice another step and advising people to reconsider their need to travel, which is the next level up, because I don't want to see another Australian detained like Yang Henjun or Chung Lei, and I don't want to see what happened to the so-called two Michaels from Canada who were detained for a number of years for no reason.
It seems to me those risks have really recently increased substantially. How should Australia manage a trade relationship with a partner whose approaches to free speech, arbitrary detention, human rights and the justice system threaten the interests and freedoms of Australian citizens?
This is a really tricky issue, Amanda, because, as you know, we don't trade with other countries in the world because we approve of their political system. We trade with them because we have things we want to sell and they have things they want to buy from us. And politicians shouldn't really intervene in that unless there's a really good national interest and national security reason to do so. But I think we have to be very cognizant of these risks. I think we need to manage these risks. I think we need to provide as much other options for Australians as possible to diversify their international trade so they're not reliant on a country which sees our trade as an opportunity to economically coerce us and as a weapon to hold over us. Most of our other trading partners don't do that to us, and therefore trusted suppliers and trusted trading partners are a much better bet than an authoritarian regime that wants to weaponise trade against us.
I'd like to think that smart operators in a free market would find partners who are less inclined to engage in those coercive behaviours a more attractive destination for their goods.